It's about 9:06. And we have Councilor Lisa Wheeler Brown, myself, Janet Long, the chair, and Joe Barkley present. I believe, is there someone else we're waiting on, or is that was potentially going to be?
Patty said she was coming. I sent her a text to see if she's on her way. I haven't heard back yet.
All right, well, she's probably driving, and we can at least start perhaps with our first order of business, and that would be public comment. And I do have a card from Mr. Rask. Would you like to come around to the front instead of talking to our
I can stand over here.
Yeah, that would be good.
A couple comments. I asked Mr. Miller before the meeting, because I took an interest in this piece of paper that was at your seats, and it's an APTA document. APTA is a lobbying group, American Public Transportation Association. And I think any documents that are given to you that are from lobbying organizations should be labeled as such. So that's one comment I have. As far as the legislative priorities, which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is the main topic of today's discussion, I think the focus should be on the taxpayers and what is good for the taxpayers, how to use tax dollars wisely, as opposed to plans that may or may not work out in an environment where PSTA's ridership has dropped 22% in 3 years and continues to drop for various reasons. There are now various reports out, studies that Mr. Miller has passed to the board that talk about what the reasons for this are, why this drop is, but these same organizations, whether it's APTA, that was one of the reports, or others, they failed to see this coming, whereas those of us who were involved in opposing Greenlight Pinellas and Go Hillsborough said all along, there's no need, no demand, we're living through a transportation revolution. Mr. Barkley on the way in said that those who are opposed to rail have never driven east-west in this county. Well, why was Greenlight Pinellas north-south then? And why do you have a project as one of your legislative priorities, the so-called Central Avenue BRT, that takes a lane away on First Avenue South and First Avenue North? This is a major east-west corridor. So again, I ask you to look at what's good for the taxpayer. Don't just look at the state as a place you can tap for money. If you don't need the money, and I don't really see there is, then don't go ask for the money. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rask. Patty, would you please take your seat up here as a member of the committee, and let the record reflect that Councilor Johnson has walked in. Okay, may I have a motion, please, to approve the minutes, and or if there are any amendments from our last meeting, please.
Move approval.
May I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, Mr. Miller, transit feasibility plan.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
Attached, or in the packet, and then at your places is a T-BARTA letter, and attached to the letter is a resolution that the executive director of T-BARTA has, or the T-BARTA board approved, and asked for PSTA as well as a number of other organizations, HART, FDOT, the MPOs, etc., to approve this resolution, which essentially is a resolution of support for the state, the legislature's action to have T-BARTA be the lead agency in implementing the recommendations of the regional transit feasibility study. I thought, actually, Lisa, when I was meeting with her on one-on-one earlier this week, she noticed that the legislative committee only had the minutes to be approved as an action item. So I said, oh, well, this would be a good committee to approve, to make a recommendation to the board of this resolution. We did have a discussion about this at the executive committee meeting on Monday, and suggested some changes. I've sent it to Alan Zimmett. He's going to be putting in the one change that the executive committee asked for, which was to clarify that the word implementing by T-BARTA meaning implementing of the proposed rapid bus system that they're talking about between St. Petersburg and Tampa and Wesley Chapel, does not necessarily mean operating that service. And that it certainly does not mean operating the first piece of that component of that regional plan, the Central Avenue BRT. That implementing does not necessarily mean operating. And so Alan's wordsmithing something up now to look at.
So Brad, I would like to clarify a piece of the conversation that some folks are having confusion about, because we at PSTA are always talking about the BRT plan for Central Avenue. The designated gold standard BRT system that T-BARTA agency as well as the TMA are now talking about as a release of the document and the vote to go into public engagement. The designated catalyst BRT system for that does not necessarily include our Central Avenue line. It is a connector to
Correct.
that 41-mile system. So I think that point needs to be clearly articulated as we speak about the issue, so there is absolutely no confusion between one piece and the other, especially as it relates to the funding. Because you know that we have identified the funding for our piece of the Central Avenue BRT section, and the funding for the 41-mile system has yet to be determined,
Right.
because that will all come towards the end of the public engagement process, which is hopefully going to transpire at the end of about 18 months. And so the reason for that outline, as I share with everyone, are you listening? Because this is answering some of
Yes.
the questions
Yes,
that
I'm
you asked
listening,
the other
exactly,
day.
yes.
The reason I'm articulating it in this way is to ensure that we don't get the cart before the horse. There is potential for a lot of changes to take place in this plan as we move through the public engagement process, which is what the public engagement process is all about.
Right.
Is to solicit input from our citizens to the folks that have, devised the plan based on data. So with that said, I'll stop my comments in a moment, and please ask the young woman that just joined us to identify herself.
Hello, I'm Keandra Darling. I am Lisa's legislative aide.
Well, welcome to our meeting. I hope you'll find it interesting.
Oh, yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you for taking your time. So anyway, with that said, please continue.
So, my recommendation would be that the legislative committee could recommend this resolution as it may be amended with any suggestions, additional suggestions that you might have to amend it to the PSTA board as part of an action item to approve the resolution, and hear the PSTA board will hear for the first time the plan presented to you by Scott Pringle. In addition, Rick Homans from the Tampa Bay Partnership will also speak to talk kind of in the spirit of what Commissioner Johnson was asking for, sort of what, a purpose and need kind of statement of why such a express bus system, our premium system for the Tampa Bay region is needed. And they both agreed to do that. So they'll be there at the end of the month to present. For most of you, I know, you will have heard the presentation before. I asked Scott to maybe not totally respond, but to acknowledge and maybe respond a little bit to some of the articles that have been written since he's first presented it. I know he's going to be presenting again to the St. Pete City Council tomorrow, and probably other places he's going to be presenting. He presented at the Heart Board earlier this week, so to have him kind of respond to whatever's, some of the things that are being said about it, and maybe correct some things that have been said about it. But your point about distinguishing the BRT project as integral to the whole system, but still separate, and certainly on the funding separate, it is a good one.
Thank you. Questions?
The changes that were submitted to legal, will we have that back by Wednesday?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Good. We need to make sure.
You might have already sent it.
That's in place also. This is going to be strictly an informational item. It's not going to be an action item. Or are you planning to have it be an action item on Wednesday?
By February 28th, PSTA board meeting, I would have it be an action item.
Okay.
My thought was that today you could take this committee could recommend it to the PSTA board subject to review of the revisions that legal has made, and we'll send that out to the committee. I'm going to send that out to the whole PSTA board once he drafts. I told you that what he is writing is a clause that will define the word implementing a little, define the word implementing by T-BARTA of this premium transit plan to not necessarily include operating the said project.
Well, people that are not attending, some of the other meetings associated with various committees, will they be able to have enough information from the presentations and from the other information that's provided by the commission meeting, the full commission meeting, to be able to make a clear decision on that, do you think?
I think so. I think one idea would be to, I'm sure we'll have it, I would imagine we'll have it back today or very quickly, and we can add it to the agenda for the planning committee as well, which meets next week.
Next week.
Yeah, next week. So we can get further input, or board members that are on that committee can look at it too.
Okay.
Before it goes to the board at the end of the month in 2 weeks.
Yeah, 2 weeks, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
A question. If this is strictly informational, right?
The T-BARTA letter,
Right.
okay?
It doesn't state anywhere that it is strictly informational. And how will it get to the public for them to comment on it? How will we receive?
Well, first of all, there is a plan being drafted as we speak to move this into the public engagement process. That's what the whole purpose of inviting Mr. Pringle to the meeting. We've had it presented at the TMA group. We've had it presented at T-BARTA. We're inviting them to come present to the county commission. You're more than free to request from your clerk or whoever sets your agenda to invite them to your city council. Have they been?
They come tomorrow.
They're coming to the
That's
St.
to
Pete
St.
City
Pete.
Council.
But Joe, have they been to yours?
No.
Have you
No.
asked them?
No?
And, well, we're on the board. We have a
Right.
responsibility to be presenting the information out to our circles of influence and our stakeholders. There have been articles in the press that right now are not terribly favorable to our plan, and that will all be taken into consideration by the T-BARTA board as well as we move forward. This is not a plan that's being created and developed in a vacuum. So
I
if you
didn't say
have,
that,
if you
Janet.
had,
I'm just asking.
I'm responding. If you have
Okay.
suggestions about other ways to move it through a community of almost 1 million people, but we are all interested in hearing what your thoughts might be, because it's not an easy task, and that's why we've asked for approximately 18 months to do it. We do have a request for an appropriation in for the state to help us with a funding source that we don't have to necessarily ask our citizens in Pinellas County for any kind of a tax increase. I want to say that again for those folks that are listening. This is not a plan to go to the public and ask for a tax increase.
You more than answered the question.
Okay, I just
Okay,
feel
I'm
a
just-
necessity to be very thorough with my responses, so there is absolutely no effort to misinterpret what I'm saying, and I don't know what
Janet,
else
I
to
didn't
do.
mean to misinterpret, I was just
No, I'm
asking
asking you for your
how to get it
suggestions,
out.
Counselor.
Well, I can, certainly ask my clerk to
Yeah.
schedule things.
There'll be
That's
meetings with
problem.
different chambers, there'll be meetings with different neighborhood groups, there'll be meeting with different community organizations. I mean, every effort is going to be made to not repeat the mistakes that we've learned from the past. Anybody else on the committee have a question?
And one of those opportunities is the PSTA board meeting.
Which is televised, and so is our commission meeting. A lot of them are, yours is too, is it not?
Yes.
So, hopefully, if given there's enough public engagement, everyone will, get on, not everyone, there's always gonna be those folks that don't wanna see progress, don't wanna see us move forward, they like things the way they are, and they seem to think that there is no need. I find that a bit remarkable, given the challenges that we have within our economy and within our region, but everyone, it's America, and everybody's welcome to their opinion. And with that said, I have a card to hear from Mr. Rask, and I would ask you to please come where we can
Sure.
all see you.
Can I just speak once you have a motion in a second, so I know?
You're here, and we're here, and everyone's gonna have an opportunity.
This is an action item, but, okay.
Well, is this not what you wanted to talk on?
Yes, but it's an action item, so I've requested before that when there's a motion and a second, so we can comment on what is being said. That's all. So as far, I wasn't gonna comment on this item, but you're talking about public engagement. I view this action item as merely, rubber stamping, moving it forward to the board. But since you're talking about public engagement, you know how public engagement failed during Greenlight Pinellas. You know how it failed during Go Hillsborough, where it became just a way to channel money to a political consultant, in that case Beth Latham. And if you saw WTSP Noah Pransky's report yesterday on the stadium deal, how that's gone south, involving two law firms. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but Commissioner...
Which stadium are you referencing?
The stadium that Mr. Hagan of the Hillsborough County Commission would like to have built in Ybor City. And just yesterday, I public records requested all records to Mr., I forget his last name, Irwin. It's an unusual last name, but it stinks, just like previous efforts. And Chairman Long mentioned 1 million people in Pinellas County. Public engagement goes beyond having Scott Pringle or anybody else like that go before a county or a city council or a community association. Public engagement means actually reaching out to voters. And one of the recommendations in the after the 2010, what was it called, Moving Hillsborough Forward referendum, one of the recommendations in the Hillsborough MPO post-mortem was that you sample random voters. You have Central Avenue BRT that you want to move forward now. That is Ms. Calvert and I are going to meet with Ms. Sobush here at 10 o'clock, but it seems that is already a fatally flawed project. Not only does it take away a travel lane in each direction, it removes parking, and there are other substantive issues with it that I'm not going to go into now. So you really should reach out to people and not try to paint a picture that isn't reality. Because when people see what the plan really is, and I'm not suggesting that there's an effort to mislead the public. What I'm saying is that when people sit here at PSTA headquarters, it's very easy to think, oh, this is how it's going to be. This is all going to be good. We love our plan. The public doesn't love your plan. Once they see the reality of the plan, they're not going to love the plan. So whether it's Central Avenue BRT or RTFP, engage, just randomly pick voters from the voter rolls. That was a recommendation already in 2011, and no one has followed that recommendation to this date. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rask, for your input. And I'm sure that Ms. Sobish will be, is she here now?
No, not here.
No, but I'll be at that meeting.
Oh, good, maybe the others will be as well. So, Alan, do you have any comments on any of the things we're talking about at the moment, since you're on the phone?
No, Commissioner, not on the current topics. I mean, certainly we have some things to talk about from here in Tallahassee on our legislative update, but right now I'm just listening.
Well then, if we could, I assume, Brad, that you have enough direction to move forward and take this, get your questions answered here before we take it up any further, or what is your pleasure,
Sure,
members?
that's fine.
What would you like to do? Do you want to move it forward for Brad and his staff to work on before we bring it back to another committee or the board?
That was my original intent. It's really up to you.
All right, then please give me a motion to do so.
I'm a little, as I asked previously, number one, I would like to see that the legal department has implemented the changes that we talked about.
Okay.
And number two, my concern is that the entire commission may not have enough information to make a decision next week, or
Okay.
2 weeks.
Well, given your comments, Brad, may I please ask that you invite Mr. Holman to present, not Mr. Holman, Mr. Holton, to answer questions regarding this letter. It's signed by him, it's to the secretary at FDOT. The letter would not have been written with this much detail had there not been a necessity. And I would presume, though I'm not sure, that he's trying to respond to a request from FDOT.
Is there a timeline on this?
No. Your points are well taken, and like I said, we'll just add this to the planning committee's agenda so that it does have more board members take a look at it before it goes. It won't have those legal, that extra clause written, and it'll still come to the PSTA board at the end of the month.
Okay.
No problem.
All right, thank you, and please, let's move on to item number 4, because that is the purpose of why we are here today.
Yeah.
Totally. So please. Alan, do you want to start with the state report, please?
Sure, Commissioner, I'm happy to. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Happy halfway mark. We are officially, today is day 30 of session, so we are officially halfway over, which is always good news. So here's where we are when it comes to the main legislative priority, obviously, that we had of the legislature to fund the integrated app program. We've been working on the budgets for the last few weeks here in Tallahassee. Last week, both chambers passed their respective budgets out of the full appropriations committees. And this week, today and tomorrow, they'll be moving those bills off the floor of both chambers. And then obviously in a couple weeks, we'll go to conference like we're used to, and we'll go from there. We all knew going into it was a very tight budget year because of the hurricane and a number of other issues that have impacted state budgets. And it was going to be a challenging year for anybody to receive funding. We made the requests, we had them put in, they were heard in the chambers and debated, and as of right now, we do not have funding in the budget for the app, and I kind of want to talk a little bit about why. I don't believe it has any, and I've been assured it doesn't have anything to do with the program itself. It has more to do with the process and where things ended have seemed to be ending up this year. And that is, quite frankly, Senator Brandis, who obviously was helping us on this issue. It's something that he believes in would be a good thing for the community and for PSTA to work on. He received, I want to say, about 25 or 30 requests from the community in this budget area, funding of various projects across the spectrum in the TED budget, which is obviously where our project lies. And then the current vacancy in North County in that Senate seat added a number of requests. He took it, although he certainly didn't have to, he took it upon himself to try to help those parts of the county and the rest of that district with some of their projects as well, so that they weren't left here without anyone to champion their causes. So obviously that means his list grew. So Ron and I talked with Senator Brandis, and essentially what he told us was, listen guys, I've got, now I'm up to 30 or 40 requests. I'm not the chair anymore. I'm only going to get so much done. And so I really had to be very careful in what I chose to put forward to the chair as my priorities. And it really came down, and I know, Brad, we talked about this on the call, and we kind of walked through it, but it really came down to, we got you all $1 million last year for the planning of the project that we wanted. And when I had to cull my list down to a smaller number, I really had to look at those that were funded last year and try to help some other folks this year. And so again, not saying he doesn't support the project, doesn't want to find other ways maybe to help us move it forward, whether that be next session or through FDOT internally or other mechanisms. I think he still fully supports that idea. But just when he had to down select his list and really pick where he was going to concentrate and get, he was only going to get 4 or 5 projects total in that budget area, and like I said, that his number was huge. And so that's where we are. We've talked to the chair. I've talked to Chair Bradley, the Senate Appropriations Chairman, who took Senator Latval's place on chairing that committee. And he said that essentially the project funds have really been depleted. So barring some new news of more project money showing up in the budget late in the process, which sometimes does happen, barring anything like that, it looks like this year we're just not going to be in the budget. And again, I don't think it has anything to do with, it has nothing to do with anything other than the fact that we were funded last year. And quite frankly, we were one of a small handful of projects in the entire budget, not just transportation, but the entire state budget that the governor did not veto. And so I think we're in a different position than most people this year. And the senator had to recognize that. And I think he had to just, again, make a decision on where he was going to attempt to try to help the community. And that's just kind of where we are. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but that's kind of that's the down and dirty of where we are today.
Well, I guess the good news is that Secretary Gwynn sits on several of our local boards and has been more than supportive, and there's always an opportunity there to hopefully make up. Yep, sorry. And the conversation that Senator Brandis and I have had about this project, we talked, I know BRT has been mentioned several times since I've been on the call, and if you all remember, that was something that wasn't funded directly through the legislature. That was something that we went to FDOT. And with the support of our delegation and the folks who wanted to see that happen, they helped us get that funding directly from the FDOT work plan. And so I think this is something, I don't know exactly what will happen with this project when as we discuss that type of funding or that mechanism for funding. But I think it's something he's open to. I think it's something he's open to helping us go back to, whether it's to the district or whether it's to the secretary here at home office, to perhaps try that again. And so again, it has nothing to do with support of the project or what he wants to see happen. It just really came down to there's only so many slices of the pie, and he had to really be careful about what he picked and what he worked on. I think we got that message, but I would like to ask you in your next conversation with him, could you please confirm his desire to continue to help us with FDOT, because I think will be important to our success.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think he would tell you all, one of the things that he and I talked about was obviously it's an early session this year, so we're going to be done, like I said, in 30 days, so early March we'll be finished. and the budget doesn't roll out, in effect until the new year, July 1. And so I think, so yes, I'll absolutely confirm that, but we've also talked about him coming, like he's done in years past, to PSTA, talking about how session went, and talking about, in the interim between now and next session, what can he do to help? And he said, absolutely, yes, he's looking forward to doing that again. So I think we can not only relax that conversation, but then the next time we talk, which will be today, actually, but also we can do that there at PSTA like we've done in the past.
And how about, can you coordinate with his chief of staff and find out when might be an amenable time, because they all take off right after they leave Tallahassee, as you know.
Yeah.
But it would be good to start putting that on the calendar so that those of us that engage with him more frequently have an opportunity to start planning a fairly thorough presentation to him about where we are, where we're trying to go, why, and the work that's been done from here forward, because
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Commissioner. We can definitely do that. And I would say, so number one, yes, we'll get dates on the calendar as soon as possible. But just for planning purposes, you're absolutely right. You know better than anyone that when session's over, everybody likes to take a little breather. And whether that be with their family or for the other business that they conduct. So I would say late March is probably a good earmark of time. Of a date on the calendar, and so again, not he certainly hasn't committed to the time yet, but I would just say for everyone's planning purposes, anything earlier than late March probably isn't going to work, because he is going to probably he's going to want to spend time with his family and take a little break, and so I think we've got at least until then, but we'll work on the calendar with him.
I would like to suggest mid to late
Sure.
April, since my calendar especially is pretty full in the month of March already. I don't know about everybody else's, but I would like to think that we're going to be one of many groups that want to meet with him when he comes back.
Sure.
Do you know
Sure, absolutely.
if on top of the additional work that he's taken on for North County, is Senator Roussan helping assist with that load?
I'm sure Senator Roussan is in some specific areas. I don't have any projects that I'm working on in North County that he's helping with, but that doesn't mean he's not doing it. That's just me personally. But the entire delegation. I mean, even Senator Young over in Tampa, has agreed to look at projects if there's something that we think she could help with. She's obviously she chairs health policy, so it kind of comes down to their unique position in the chamber. But I think the entire delegation, I think Senator Brand is more than anyone else, because it's such a large part of Pinellas County, and that's obviously where his passion is.
Is she
and
still,
so I think he's kind of been the leader, but sorry.
Is she still working on that railroad trust funding mechanism? Is that still alive, or did I see that died somewhere?
No, Commissioner, it is definitely still alive. Senator Galvano signed off as the prime co-sponsor. So it's certainly moving forward. And as you know, it doesn't take effect until I think 2020 and 2021 if the funding were to be diverted into these. So essentially, what it does is it takes money from money that wouldn't be used for the Sunrail, for the rail project, and moves it over into a new fund to be used in Tampa and Miami for new transportation technology. So not necessarily, so think autonomous vehicles, autonomous buses, the things that we have all talked about here at PSTA, that is absolutely still moving and alive.
Good.
Good.
And it's
Good
one of
to
our
hear.
top priorities.
Good to hear. Thank you, because it's one of our top priorities as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And keep in mind, we have two pilots that we're working on, one in South County and one in North County.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay? All right, on the federal legislative
Well,
stuff.
Commissioner, if I could just very
Yeah.
quickly highlight, he talked about number one on our list, not moving forward. I got some good news yesterday that number two is moving forward.
All right.
Well, increased urban transportation disadvantage funds remains to be seen if it's increased. It is at least the same.
Alive.
It is being
not
protected
dead.
at the same level as it has been, and the state or the amendment, and I forwarded it to Patty, also identified. They carved out a $1.75 million piece of the transportation disadvantage funds to continue the mobility enhancement grants, which is the funding source that we use for our TD late shift successful program with Uber, and is a model across the state. That funding, that one-time funding was running out, and we were at threat that they were not going to have any kind of funding for that. They do. It's a smaller amount, but 1.75 is more than I thought they were going to come up with. So
Good. Patty, did you
Good
have a
news.
comment?
I do have a comment. One of the people that was on that program that didn't know me or that we have a store or anything else actually made enough money to move out and get their own place. And the only reason I met them was because they applied for a job at our store. And, you know, to find out that it actually works without digging for it was important. And to be afraid that we would lose that was even more important. So thank you so much. It really, I mean, it's something that is working, and it's something that I think that our tax dollars are vested in, is getting that kind of thing going. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and Commissioner, this is Alan again, just to add one piece, and I forgot to mention this earlier, to build on those points. There is language in the budget, again, this year, and again, that the budget isn't final, so we're monitoring it. Things could certainly change. But there is some language that, again, directs that a study be conducted to, again, look at the formula. I know we've talked in years past about the rural funding versus urban funding, urban area, urban county funding. And so, again, the legislature is pushing for a study to determine, is there a better way of doing this than the way we're currently doing, or is the current model the best model? And so that hasn't been decided yet. The language is pretty direct and new, but we do think that probably will make it out in the end, that there will be a study conducted to, again, look at the formula and maybe to address some of the concerns that we've shared in the past about the urban area funding.
Excellent.
Okay.
All right, now can we move to the federal piece?
Yeah.
Steve, are you still there?
I am here, Commissioner. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Where's Harry this morning?
Harry had another meeting, so he has a conflict and won't be able to join us today, but hopefully I'll be able to carry the water for us.
Well, so please express to him that we miss him very much, and we'll look forward to the next time we chat. So continue,
Absolutely.
please.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And my report today is going to be a little bit more at a 30,000-foot level, because so much of what's happening in Washington is still focused on the budget and trying to get an appropriations bill done for fiscal year 2018. Obviously, if you recall, the federal fiscal year starts on October 1st, and we still do not have a final budget. We're operating under the fourth continuing resolution, and that expires on Thursday, on February 8th. The House has passed an extension that would carry funding at current levels through March 23rd. They passed that earlier this week, but the holdup has been, really have been two things. One of them is immigration reform, which seems to have been set aside for right now. And the other issue is increasing the budget caps for this year and fiscal 2018 and then fiscal year 2019. And the reason people want to increase the caps is there has been a real push for more defense spending this year. And in order, if the law wasn't changed, budget sequestration or the across-the-board cuts would then kick in after the budget was finalized. So there's a realization that in order to increase defense, they have to increase the caps, and that requires 60 votes. And so in the Senate Democrats hold a huge amount of leverage to be able to say, if you want to increase defense, we want to increase domestic spending, non-defense spending. And ultimately, that's good for transportation and transit, because of a significant cut that was proposed by President Trump was in the capital investment grant program that FTA administers, and that's where we're going to be looking for funding for the Central Avenue BRT project. So the effort to try to increase spending overall for domestic programs will help PSTA in the end. Even though it won't be directly affected on this year's project, it will increase overall spending for us fiscal 2019, and we hope that's when our project will be funded. That process of trying to increase the caps could be resolved as early as today.
Wow.
And
that's very exciting.
yeah, the goal is, the Senate leaders have kind of ignored the president, and they've just gone ahead and negotiated on their own and said, we're going reach a deal, and then they're going to try to pass it by tomorrow so that there will not be a government shutdown if they can help it.
Excellent.
And then what will happen after that is that, so there will be a continuing resolution until March 22nd, and between now and then they will try to work out the differences between the House and Senate on all 12 appropriations bills, so that by mid-March they'll have an omnibus appropriations bill that will include, hopefully, if not full funding, very close to full funding for the capital investment grant program. Again, that's where we're going to be looking for money for the small starts program. So there is a path towards resolving the budget, not I won't say crisis, but impasse that has been really kind of clouding Washington for a number of months.
Okay.
That's good news.
Then moving ahead, as believe it or not, on Monday, the president's going to be sending his proposal for the fiscal year 2019 budget to the Congress. And we don't expect there to be any real differences between this budget and what he proposed last year in May. So again, we expect big cuts proposed for transit, for the Federal Transit Administration. Congress, so far, even as Republican-controlled Congress, have been very supportive of FTA and the Capital Investment Grant Program, so we're hopeful that that will continue. And again, with these higher budget caps, that should free them up to be able to spend the money on these programs, which will help us tremendously. Also on Monday, the president's a long-awaited infrastructure proposal is supposed to be unveiled on Monday as well. We don't have much detail. We had a meeting yesterday with the number 3 person at the Department of Transportation, the Undersecretary for Policy, and he said there really are only 3 principles that the White House is standing on when it comes to its infrastructure bill, and they aren't particularly helpful for PSTA. But what they are is the president wants, as we heard at the State of the Union, $1.5 trillion in infrastructure investment. Now, the only problem with that is the proposal will only include, and that's over 10 years. I should emphasize these numbers are spread out over 10 years. But the proposal will only include $200 billion in federal funding. And of that $200 billion, there's really no new money there. The idea that they're proposing is that we'll cut programs like the Community Development Block Grant Program or the FTA Capital Investment Grant Program, and then, as they say, repurpose those funds for infrastructure.
So wait, if all they want, if he wants 1.5 trillion, but he only wants 200 billion from the feds, you said?
Yes,
Well,
that
where's
is
the
correct.
rest of it coming from?
Well, I think they're hoping that the credit programs, there are several transportation credit programs like the TIFIA program, which is a loan program, a low-interest loan program, and there's a water infrastructure program that's similar to that, and I think they're hoping that those kinds of credit programs, as well as an increased availability of private activity bonds, which many local governments use to borrow funds, they're hopeful that that will leverage the kind of money that they're talking about. So if PSTA was to build a new facility and needed to borrow money, then you might say it's a $100 million facility. If you borrowed the money, then they would count that towards their infrastructure total. Even though the federal share of money that they're talking about, under the infrastructure proposal, I think overall, I should also make clear, they're talking about, they don't have any fixed numbers, but they're talking about reducing the federal share from, like, say, 80-20 or 50-50 down to 20% federal share. So you can see for a variety of reasons why Congress they're not incredibly enthusiastic about this proposal yet, because there's really no financing, no funding that's involved.
But it just speaks to the trend of the feds push it down to the state pushes it down to the counties and municipalities, and we end up picking up the slack for both of them.
That is the trend, and I think that is ultimately a long-term trend, but I think Congress probably is not going to go along with this idea of cutting federal shares down to 20% because they know that their communities and their states are stretched thin already. So it's going to be, I don't anticipate this bill making a lot of progress this year, but I think it's going to be a debate and a battle over what the federal role will be in infrastructure, and I think that will take a year or two to play itself out. If I may, real quick, the other 2 principles that the Trump administration is going to be highlighting are rural infrastructure, which doesn't help PSTA, and they do want to shorten the permitting time, the federal permitting time. So they're going to be proposing some changes to the NEPA process, the environmental review process, and trying to make the review concurrent rather than sequential. So some of that will be good and helpful for transit agencies, but I think the devil will always be in the details.
Okay, and what is the third leg?
No, permitting, rural transportation, and then 1.5 trillion. Those are the three principles they're really going to be highlighting.
All right, and I have a question before.
Yes.
What the accidents that are currently happening on our big interstate transit systems, how are they dealing with the lack of maintenance and upkeep on tracks and trains? I mean,
Well,
in light of what's been happening, yeah.
Okay, so Amtrak it's a different pot of federal money. It's always been a bone of contention. Republicans don't like Amtrak. They've been looking to cut it, and if states want to fund, long distance routes outside of the coastal routes, they're more than happy to shed that responsibility. But there is a growing realization. The focus is going to be in the very near term on technology called positive train control. And Congress has mandated that by the end of this year, the railroads, passenger railroads, and the freight railroads carrying hazardous materials have to be 100% compliant with positive train control, which would shut down the train had there been, these kinds of accidents, like the one in Virginia or the one in Florida, or South Carolina rather, would have been avoided because it would have overridden the engineer and they would have been able to shut the trains down automatically. But that technology hasn't been deployed throughout the country yet, and on every rail line. So they're working to try to do that. But your question about maintenance is going to be one about, is going to continue to be one about what is the federal role in terms of funding Amtrak? Should this be a federal responsibility, or should it be something that the states and localities pick up a bigger share of?
Well, I thought anything that crossed state lines was federal.
Historically, yes, Commissioner, it has been. It's part of the Interstate Commerce Clause.
That's what I thought. So, very interesting. You're just a wealth of information. Thank you very much. Any other good news for us today? Can you give us some good news?
I wish it was better news. Sorry.
Commissioner, I have a question for you, Steve. So, my understanding is that there's some timeline, I don't know what it is, maybe when the administration or FTA will issue their New Starts report that we will be in?
That actually could come out as early as Monday. Yes, you're right. I highlighted that. But that is an important point, and I'm sorry I overlooked that, but you're right. That comes out the same time as the budget. It may be on Tuesday, the day after the budget, but it always comes out with the budget.
Okay, well, we're eager to confirm what we think is going to be in that report as being positive, and then it'll tee us up. Well, you said that maybe there will be a budget, a 2018 budget approved by Congress maybe in mid-March, right around when we come up there to DC for our next trip, and we'll have the New Starts report in hand at that time.
And Brad, I'm glad you brought that up, and I apologize for not mentioning that. The one thing I will tell you, though, is unlike it was last year, we don't anticipate the budget will list projects, for funding. So pre the Trump administration, for 20 years, Presidents Bush, Obama, and Clinton, they would list projects in their budget saying, these are the New Starts and Small Start projects we believe we are asking Congress to fund. I don't think the Trump administration, because they don't support this program, will list projects. But if we get to the top of the queue, like we hope we are, in terms of a very good recommendation through the evaluation process, then we're hopeful that then when Congress does appropriate the money for fiscal year 2019, then DOT and FTA will give us the Small Starts grant agreement. I will say, the acting FTA administrator, Jane Williams, has said very, very positive things about BRT projects. while they're not enamored with expensive rail projects, they are very supportive of bus rapid transit projects. So I think PSTA has done everything possible to put itself in a good position for that report next week.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you so much for your advocacy. We're grateful.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, any other questions from the board? Where did Joe went to the men's room, I guess?
Yes.
Did you have another point?
I just wanted to just highlight the other document that is at your places. It's titled Reauthorization Discussion Questions for Internal Outreach. And Steve, I only have a paper copy of it. I'll send it to you. This is, as was stated earlier, this is a document I received at a recent APTA meeting that I attended. APTA, like all the different transportation groups in Washington, are looking ahead and just starting the process now to formulating their policy documents for the next authorization bill, which I'm sure Steve knows. I forget when that will actually, current authorization ends, but it's a little ways out, and then we'll have a new one. And I know APTA and AASHTO, which is the highway group, and all the other groups are starting to come up with their policy discussions within their organizations. And within APTA, there's private sector members, public sector members, rail, bus, autonomous vehicles, all these different kinds of groups. And this document was passed out at a meeting by the legislative committee that I was at, just as I thought it was kind of an interesting list of questions for policymakers or folks that want to have influence on the federal policy in the future on transit to weigh in on. There's always the discussion about, well, every single transit system, New York City on down to the smallest system with one bus, believes they need more money to do more things. And we're always asking for more money, more resources to do more things, whether transportation disadvantage or whatever. And then, but what happens when you don't get what you ask for? Is it a better strategy to come up with a plan B or plan C? You know, that there's some questions in there listed in there, whether that's a good strategy questions about it. Trying to anticipate what Congress and these signals we're getting from the Trump administration about reducing the federal role and putting more burden on the locals and the state role, how the transit world should respond to that. And I didn't really expect you to do anything with this, just to see these are the kind of questions that I think are being asked in Washington, D.C. about transportation in general. And I thought it was kind of just kind of an interesting list of questions.
Well, the thought occurs to me, so you haven't seen this list, have you, Steve?
I have not, no.
Well, it's very high level and almost ethereal in the way in which it asks for this input. And my thought is that as policymakers, we're always focused on trying to do the best things for our citizens, and some people don't think so, but most of us do rely a lot on the input we get from our citizen advisory groups. And I'm curious about what kind of a response we might get if we push this out to our citizen advisory board, Brad, and we can do the same thing at T-BARTA and maybe with TMA, and just see what might your average citizen be thinking in terms of these kind of questions that ask specifics about funding. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about public dollars, and these and the input that we might get from our citizens could be very valuable in helping us stretch our thinking a bit. Just a thought. I don't know if anybody else agrees with me, but.
At this committee meeting that I was at, they reported that, the Trump administration has proposed that the federal share on projects go from 80-20, which it is now for most projects, some 50-50, to 20-80. And the highway lobby has told the transit lobby, transit's in a better situation than we are because highways have always been 100% funded by the feds. And so transit, they say, has a lot more experience in coming up with local support, which I think is kind of funny. But the highway people are grousing more about because they would go down to 2080 for highways too. And so they're.
But let's keep in mind what's the senator's name? It's the gentleman from South Florida, Diaz-Balart?
Yeah.
Congressman, yeah.
That's from, that's head of the Appropriations Committee, right, Steve?
Yeah.
Remember
Yeah.
what he said to us? The president can put forward whatever he wants. He is not responsible for writing the budget. And I think
True.
having input from the local folks to the feds is really critical so that they understand not just what their own community is thinking, but throughout in our case, throughout the state. What do you think?
You're right. I just think that when we plan, and although I'm 100% behind you in the sharing with our boards and T-BARDA and so forth, I just wish there was an easier vehicle to get to the people that are going to actually vote. You keep referring to green light, and we thought we had it made.
Well,
And
I prefer.
I'm just talking about the people.
I hear you.
We're, right now,
I
Niles
hear you.
Park is in a huge debate over who's going to be the next mayor. And every time I go, what do I hear? Transportation. I mean, every single person.
You hear it all over the place.
And that's the voting public that I'm hearing it from,
Yeah.
not from here, not from.
I hear you. The thing is, Commissioner, when we were in Washington and met with Congressman Diaz-Balart, the first words out of his mouth, right, Steve? The president's budget is dead on arrival. Do you remember
Yes.
that? Yeah, because
Yeah.
it's them that write the budget. And that's why it's so important for them to hear from us about we are the voice of our constituents. We have to carry that forward and make sure that people understand who are in positions to make the decisions, right?
And Commissioner, if I may, that's probably for the BRT project more important than ever because this is a federal program that the Trump administration would just as soon kill. And if people like us don't speak up and say this is an important, we need a federal contribution to make this project a reality, then Congress may just go along with it. But if we speak up and let them know how important this is, I think we can continue to see that it's fully funded.
Well, and as I recall, please correct me if I'm wrong, they were extremely pleased with the percentage of dollars that our local money was going to put into this project, and that we were not relying totally on the federal money, right?
Absolutely. Yes, that is correct.
We are way over the threshold, right, Cassandra, in terms of the dollars that
We're over the threshold.
we're over.
Way over.
It is an extremely competitive financial plan, yes.
Yeah. So I feel good about that.
Well
Okay.
said.
She's always there to save the day, right? All right, so shall we move on for this to future meeting subjects unless there's something else that needs to be said? I don't
Nope,
see-
thank you.
Okay.
Thank you both for your
Future meeting
Input.
subjects, Brad?
I will be heading back up to Tallahassee next week for Transportation Disadvantage Day, which happens to be Valentine's Day. And then,
Not very well planned.
no. I'll
It
miss
was
the,
important.
which I think is quite, I don't know, PSTA is having mandatory sexual harassment training on Valentine's Day, which I don't know about that, but I'll miss that because I'll be in Tallahassee. I learned that from our HR department. And then hopefully we'll have a good trip to Washington, D.C. In March 18th, 19th, 20th.
Are you gonna be there just for one day, or
Just in Tallahassee for one day.
gonna fly back up?
Well, we have an FPTA board meeting on the 15th of February, the next Thursday. So I'll go up and then fly back the next day. Kind of like what we did.
Okay, any questions over here, Joe? You've been
No.
remarkably silent,
No.
but your page is full of notes
Yeah,
as well.
no, I don't have a question on
Other
this.
business, anyone? Other business? No? Somebody like to make a motion that we are adjourned?
So moved.
We are adjourned. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And for everyone's information, Alan had to leave, the session started at 10. So that's
Okay.
why he beeped off when you were on the call.
Okay,
All right?
thanks.
All right, thank you very much. Good meeting, everybody.
That's a good meeting, too.
Larissa, do you want to?
I know,
This could be-
right?
Yeah.
Is that annually?
Yeah.
Oh.
Steve's name.
Yes, that was a long time ago.
It was Steve's name.
Joe, I think you met him. He's the guy, well, they're both tall.
Here.
He's the light, white hair.